welcome to our COP Brazil Digital Davos panel on critical minerals. I think there's a lot of exciting stuff to discuss in the context of critical minerals and what's going on around the world, and in particular from the light of climate change and environment and how all these things play together. With me right now, I have two really exciting panelists, and I'll let them each do a quick introduction on and biographical background on who they are. But I guarantee you, having spoken to them before, that they're going to do a lot to enlighten us. So, Adam, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Adam Johnson. I'm the CEO of a company called Principal Mineral. In my background, I was at MP Materials, which is a rare earth business located in Southern California. So I led the vertical integration strategy there. So taking them from a mined rare earth asset in Southern California all the way through metal and magnet in Fort Worth, Texas. Then I joined a private equity firm focused on industrial decarbonization investments. And they had me lead their investment strategy into rare earths. We ended up acquiring a magnet company out of Germany called Vakuumschmelze. In the United States, it's lovingly called EVOC. And they are building a permanent magnet facility, a rare earth permanent magnet facility in South Carolina, with the support of the federal government and others. So happy to be with you here all today.
Thanks, Adam. And Trevor, I think you bring some exciting perspective from the finance side of things, but I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm the managing director at RB Milestone Group in New York. We're a couple different hats, also on B11 Ventures. So these two entities kind of feed into each other. The initial take on it back in '09 has been full service investor relations, working with small micro nano cap companies globally listed, getting them exposure to our accredited investors and qualified purchasers here in the States. And ultimately, the RBMG side is predominantly focused on public entities and putting a little fine tooth comb through them, a little bit of a VC and PE touch, if you will, getting them exposure to various audiences throughout the States, and developing awareness around these programs. A lot in traditional mining, a lot related to critical materials, but natural resources, recycling, and then on the B11 Ventures side, it's a little bit more hand holding these private companies that are looking to streamline various efforts. So getting them a little bit more beefed up to, get prepared for the public arena, institutional audience, and strategic opportunities.
Excellent. Okay, so Trevor, you and I first met when I was running a company out of Australia, and I know you do a lot of work with Australia in particular. And Adam, you were just talking about Germany. So one of the questions I'd like to kick this off with is because we've all heard a lot about China and sort of what they're doing and how they're doing it and advancements they've made. But when we look sort of globally in the developed world, if we look whether it's the US or Canada or Australia or Germany, how are these countries and their local regulations contemplating environmentalism in the context of mining and extraction and processing rights? And I guess for you in particular, Trevor, when we get to you, how does that impact how you interact with these companies from an investor perspective and from bringing them to market and these sorts of things? And again, Adam, I'll let you go first.
Sure. It's certainly a dynamic environment. So we've seen, over the last 5 years, regulations on the ground in like the EU that are driving supply chain standards and requirements for mid-sized companies, up into sort of like large industrial companies and large manufacturers around supply chain transparency and these types of things. So you have on sort of the end markets, I think that there's some policy, particularly out of the EU, that we've seen. There's also, I think, broad supply chain resiliency efforts at the corporate level and from an investor standpoint that we're starting to see over the last 5 years. This last year, I think, has been like a lot more acute and frenetic from like a scaling and availability of minerals and materials. So we're starting to see some of the like de-evolution of that, I think, on local bases, when it comes to sort of the realities on the ground, globally. I think that that hasn't changed in certain jurisdictions, but I think that um, there is a lot of demand driving these markets, and as a result, you're seeing a lot of um, sort of accessibility in areas where I think that there is generally a historical trend towards, um, lack of oversight. So we'll see how it plays out, but I think that um, we're seeing an ebb and flow of those dynamics, I think, in real time, in my view.
All right, great. Trevor, what's your take?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the supply chain management systems that are out there are single-sided. A lot of technologies do, let's just say, one piece of the whole chain of custody supply chain management system. So, I mean, it's quite fragmented across the board. Also, I mean, you have to take into account geography and certain policies in certain jurisdictions. So, looking at like what I've seen is, traditional mining of, say, these critical materials. It takes what, 15 years to get a mine into production. So, we have to look, around the world. And if we're just focusing on the US, how much silver is going to be, developed and mined in the US. And then you have to look at South America and so on. A lot of these commodities are being thrown into landfills. So, you take the end of life materials, whether it's solar panels or in general e-waste. I mean, who knows down the line, decades from now, are we going to be mining landfills? So, you look at, what are those commodities, that are end of life or, being turned into end of life quicker than, say, 20 to 25 years for a solar panel because of weather related issues. How can we capture that? So I think policy needs to change to, let's just say, a little bit more of a broader sight whereby it's not just traditionally mining for these commodities, silver, copper, aluminum, you name it, but looking at what's in what we use every day and what's being thrown out. And so, the recycling technologies that are out there, they're advancing quicker and quicker. So taking these recycling technologies and, being able to process these end of life materials into these valuable commodities, you think of it like it's it goes without saying that these opportunities are out there, but it's difficult to urban mine these end of life materials. So, there needs to be a system, that supply chain management system, that captures asset owner, end of life, through insurance, through chain of custody along the way with blockchain mechanisms to show and the reuse of that commodity, because we have an abundant amount. It's just a matter of capturing where it's all coming from and putting it back into the environment. So there's more opportunity out there than people really think, and you can expedite the process through the recycling mechanisms that are out there today.
Yeah, actually, you bring up a really good point in your last little bit there, where you said we have an abundant amount, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't really realize is that even when we're talking about stuff like rare earths, they're not particularly rare. I mean, we have more than we know what to do with all of these so-called critical minerals, which then raises the question: what does critical actually mean? And if you look around the globe, sort of course, as an individual company, you're going to have an idea of what's critical to you. Smartphones need certain minerals, and those are ubiquitous and they're everywhere in the world. And so, whatever that is definitely critical to all the producers of smartphones. But every government has put together a list of their critical minerals, and some of them are not rare at all. Some of them are like titanium, that's just kind of like lying around everywhere. Copper, it's truly abundant, and really we could probably start mining for landfills for copper today. It's been used for so long. So I'll let you go first this time, Trevor. From an investor perspective, when I'm looking at opportunities and I'm thinking about critical minerals and supply and demand and where things are versus where they're mined today versus where they might be mined in the future versus how far separated do mining and processing need to be, how do I think about this? How do I get my head around contextualizing what's actually critical, where the value is going to be? What's my first step into this from an investor perspective?
Well, you look at the consumer first, and it's always a demand-centric model. So what ultimately needs to be produced from a consumer perspective, and then I mean, there's been a lot of deglobalization happening lately, and tariffs happening. So do we have access to the materials that need to go into these products? So you have to really take a big step back and really realize, okay, what are these materials that are being used to produce these final products. We have some in the US, but a lot happens to be based abroad. Like Chile is a big arm for us to obtain copper from, but there's tariffs being put into place on and even aluminum being put into place. So there's a bit of a head scratch on certain initiatives that are happening on particular commodities. So you have to think of, okay, where are we going to be sourcing these commodities from? But ideally, you think from a U.S. standpoint, we have these mines, but are there other applications, if you will, that can be brought to surface through perhaps these recycling technologies?
Okay, and I see Tracy has joined us. Tracy is the CEO of the Critical Minerals Institute. I'll bring you on in a minute, Tracy, but let me just get through where we are with these guys. Thanks for joining us a little early here. Um, Adam, you still recall what that last question was, and do you have a take on it?
Yeah, I mean, essentially the question was, rare earths and critical minerals aren't rare. Sort of what's the problem? Is that sort of where we were? I mean,
Well,
I,
not just what's the problem, but how does, and as an investor who's not an expert in the space, how do I interpret and think about what's hot now, what's going to be hot later, what's actually critical versus what is some politician put on a list somewhere? Like, how do I think about it from an investor perspective,
I mean, I
from an
think that,
uneducated investor perspective?
yeah, yeah. So, I've been in the rare earth space for a minute. The the sort of misnomer about rare earths being rare and all that. I don't know if that does us a service or a disservice. I mean, the reality is, they probably are in the dirt outside of my office right now, but the
Mhm.
issue is that, you can't mine there and they're in such small quantities that you would have to dig up the entire city to get, a magnet, right? So, like,
Mhm.
you can't do that. So, I think that on some level, it's important to get through the cool phrases and all that kind of stuff to the reality of the challenge at hand. I mean, there's one Western rare earth mine that's producing today. There's one, in Australia that's producing today. There's some that are starting to produce at initial scales, but at like really significant scales, it's really two. There's one in Brazil that's producing and shipping it all to China. Um, there there's not that much rare earth, right? Like there is going to be abundance of Western rare earths. So you're seeing like geopolitical, like trade and other tariff policies that are probably going to drive over availability of certain forms of rare earth, right? Because anytime you're mining, there are 17 rare earth elements, 15 if you count just the lanthanides. Like you're going to get more of one or the other or a different one. And so, like, when you think about the processing, you're talking about sort of separating, tightly molecularly connected minerals from each other. And some of them are easier to separate than others, and you end up getting stuff that you may not need for certain applications versus others. So a lot of it is less about, what's being mined where and how that's is about the puzzle pieces of fitting all these things together into sort of a cohesive commercial industry, right? And so China has sort of solved that by just saying, let's just go at crazy scale and just grow and just mine more and process more and we'll just keep doing that. And so, they're willing to take that sort of supply driven strategy. investors in the Western world tend to want to know that they're not just spending money to oversupply the market. That doesn't work typically as an investment strategy. So, there's more caution there. And so it's just a different, sort of approach when you're talking about on a national level versus like an individual investor level. And so when individual investors have to really go in and make very, very strong business cases. And that's where I think what you're saying is how do you know which ones are critical today versus where they're critical or what's critical next? Oftentimes the interesting part is, the critical things that are super critical today, when you put the weight of capital markets and sort of Western innovation and everything behind it, it may not be critical in a year, especially given some of the small volumes of some of the minerals and materials. And so that's where, you really have to understand some of these spaces, understand sort of the differentiation, but then also understand the supply chains because, mining, the whole business model is different because, your NPV is 10 years out and, all that kind of stuff versus processing. It's like 3 years out versus say like advanced alloying. It's maybe like a couple years out. But those couple years out, they're not going to form until the materials are there. And then you have the integration, which is like, where are they going into? Like, is the iPhone manufacturing here? Is the EV manufacturing here? Is the battery manufacturing here? How do all those pieces fit? And that's why it's hard because rarely do you have some businesses that know how to do mining, that know how to do processing, that know how to do alloying and materials, that also know how to do sort of like the motors or the, end applications that they go into. So you end up being a slice of a supply chain that needs to form around you. And that's why you need sort of policy initiatives to sort of set up the scaffolding for those supply chains to form around and sort of, evolve and industries to form around where you're able to have the labor, you're able to have the equipment, you're able to have all the stuff to drive down the cost and competitiveness and all of that. It's a tough, like, large societal problem, and it really takes a lot of players to play a role and to make it work.
Yeah, that's a really, really important, I think, and interesting take that we've seen time and time again in a number of industries. Like Anand and I were actually just chatting about this the other day, that we've even seen this in something as fundamental to humanity as agriculture, where it used to be that we were all farmers. Realize that ConAgra is just a family farm, but because of the nature of the complexity of processing and supply chains and profit margins and supply and demand, that really, in order to become the giant success that they are, they needed to vertically integrate. And we've seen that same thing again in the oil industry, right? Where like ExxonMobil isn't just gas stations and they're not just oil rigs, they're the entire everything in between. And I think critical minerals is kind of, in many ways, too broad of a term. But I think in a lot of these spaces, we're going to see a lot of that same sort of vertical integration as we go along. But that said, Tracy,
I'll add one thing to that just so that like
okay,
the one complexity relative to the farming analogy is farming, like in the United States, you have advantages when it comes to corn, or soybeans or this. When in South America, you're going to have advantages when it comes to, bananas and other things. And then but they're all just calories for you to eat. You can choose to eat this or you can choose to eat that. Whereas with minerals, sometimes the mineral has very distinct advantages for technologies. And unless you're going to abstain from satellites or communications or telecommunication, like unless you're going to abstain from certain areas, you need all of them in different ways. And that's where the complexity, I think, comes in when you're talking about comparing it to like farm subsidy policy or something like that.
no, and I do agree there's complexity there. And I think sometime over a whiskey somewhere, we will drive this metaphor and analogy way too deep in the weeds and start talking about, wait, but some of these vegetables we get our vitamins from, and we need those vitamins. But anyhow, that's enough of that. Tracy, coming back to you, you are here a few minutes early, but since you are, I introduced you as the CEO of Critical Minerals Institute, but also you run an investor newsletter and an investor organization around critical minerals. And so, having just heard kind of both Trevor and Adam talk about their take on how investors should think about and approach this, you want to jump in and add anything and your thoughts on, or for that matter, take a few minutes to introduce yourself as well, and in your own great words as to what your expertise is, where you come from, and what you think about how investors should look at this stuff.
I, I'm really interested in your question. So if we could start with your question, Chris, and thank you for having us join you today. It's nice to see Trevor. I haven't seen you in ages.
To see you, Tracy.
Great company. Okay. So, if I knew how to invest, Chris, I wouldn't be on your event today. So we're constantly monitoring how to invest in the critical minerals. And I want to mention that there's two ways to look at it. There's short term and there's long term. If you're following Adam's very good wisdom and you're thinking about, say, you're very interested in solar class, for instance, so you want to invest in silica and you really believe in the future for solar power, then investing long term and understanding which critical minerals are required, like antimony and silica, for instance, is an excellent way to move forward. I just want to make the disclaimer: I'm not a licensed investment advisor. This is just for entertainment purposes. Okay. If you're looking more short term, what we do on investornews.com, and we get about 120 million impressions and hits a year. And what we do is we break it into the different critical minerals and we do a watch list. So you can go on our site and just click on rare earths or copper, which is very hot today, and see how all of those stocks are faring. So if you're a short-term player, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to go, hey, all the copper stocks are up. So copper's probably a good bet short term. So how's that for an answer?
Right. That is an excellent answer. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I think in the next couple of minutes, we're going to have two more panelists join us. But before they get here, I want to come back to one more sort of investor and markets question for Trevor and Adam, which is let's talk a little bit about, and we kind of hit on this already on the regulatory side. But, Adam, you spoke about the fact that, producing magnets and then producing magnets in the US versus in Germany, and in general, as we're talking about supply chains, we're talking about the fact that things might be mined in one country and extracted and refined in another country and then produced into final goods in a third country. And there is, at least in recent memory, unprecedented turmoil in global trade agreements. I would imagine, and this is pure speculation on my part, but I would imagine that much like in the energy industry, if we haven't done this for a long time, we're at least starting to see purchase contracts or offtake agreements in advance of the purchase, the processing, the extraction, maybe even of the mining. So, for example, like I heard a stat, and forgive my international audience, I don't remember if it was kilograms or pounds, but it doesn't matter. I heard that every U.S. fighter jet takes 400 pounds or kilograms of magnets, basically of rare earth magnets. And I imagine that is true of French fighter jets and German fighter jets, although there might be different rare earths in theirs because who knows how they produce these things. Defense industries, and coming back to Trevor's point, I guess Adam's point as well, is you having to look at the purchaser. Defense industries are going to be giant purchasers of some subset of this stuff that we're talking about here. How does that feed into the way we think about this from a markets perspective and an investing perspective?
So the question is essentially like, how do we contemplate sort of the defense role in some of the sort of market and commercialization?
Yeah, and not necessarily from a sort of morality perspective of should we be supporting the defense industry, but more from a markets perspective of this really is critical because national defense is critical to every nation. I assume those governments are therefore pre-purchasing or agreeing to pre-purchase some amount of stuff. This has an impact on how early you can engage in the process of doing something, if those contracts are in place or not. It has an impact on the pricing of the commodities. Like how does that play together from less from an industry insider perspective and more from how does an investor think about the market perspective? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So this year the government has played more of a role, but I'll be honest, like the government is not a major market player in general in the scale of these critical minerals and materials. They're an outsized influencer from a policy standpoint. They can provide, sort of public-private partnership around driving down cost of capital, which makes individual projects more effective. And we've seen some stockpiling efforts so far this year, but from the United States, and sort of we've seen like broader, like EU, we've seen Japan, we've seen other countries sort of start to build or try to build either consortiums or domestic stockpiling efforts. So there's probably a greater impetus over a longer period of time for, federal governments, not only the United States, but across EU and frankly, in developing nations as well, to play like a role in sort of the outcome of this. We're seeing resource nationalism all over Africa. We're seeing which means like essentially they want to own more of the supply chain, which, if they're shipping the minerals out, like it behooves them to do that. But we're seeing a lot of upheaval in terms of the geopolitics of these minerals and materials and sort of what the strategy ends up looking like. That will play a role. There's without a question, geopolitics will play a role. I don't know if defense, US is the biggest defense, sort of spender in the world. I don't know if defense is going to play an outsized role, from a buying standpoint. They may in certain smaller or more esoteric minerals and materials, relative to the market volumes. But I think that where you really want to be thinking about is, the size and the scale of the market versus sort of the availability of the materials and sort of where you can play differentiated roles and sort of getting those to the places that they need to go. And the complexity of everything from logistics to extraction to, wherever you're getting it from, being a stable and steady source of these minerals and materials to justify long-term investments. I mean, there are a lot of, considering you're essentially pulling dirt and turning it into something, there are a lot of complexities that go into it. And that's why it is important to have, people like Trevor, people like Tracy, and I see Jack jumped on, going out and sort of providing knowledge. I mean, there's not a lot of, this isn't like the auto industry where there's tons of analysts that are super, deep in this. And there's large, programs like LME Week around other stuff. We need a lot more depth of knowledge around this. And we are at sort of phase one of building a Western sort of competitive industry in this arena.
Speaking of depth of knowledge, I think that's an excellent transition for me to welcome Jack onto the call. We have one more person we're going to wait for before we really get into the nitty-gritty of things. But Jack, while we're waiting, do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself and what an amazing expert you are and how you're helping the world be better educated about all these things?
I'm just an amazing guy. What's amazing is that I've survived. I started doing what we then called uncommon materials and metals in 1962 in graduate school, and I've been in this area ever since. So my perspective is probably the longest of most people that you'll ever meet, and I tend to be a bit cynical about plans, because I've watched America divest itself of primacy in these areas, and we've all watched the Chinese slowly, carefully, with many mistakes and successes, build the world's leading most robust metals industry in history. They're producing today about 60% of all the metals in the world, and at least 2/3 or more of all the so-called critical metals in the world. We've watched this happen. We had plenty of popcorn, and we said, wow, isn't that interesting? And we all assumed they would never assume leadership. They would be the great workhouse of the world, not the great leader. Well, we guessed wrong. And so now we're playing catch up, we think, but I don't see it. I don't see a carefully planned catch up here. And we don't need to catch up. We just need to be secure in things that are critical. But there's two aspects to critical. necessary and nice. Okay. The things, the materials to make television sets are nice. They're not necessary. If you think that we're in a combative world, the necessary materials are those that the military needs to keep ahead of the other guy. That's not very much, as the previous speaker said, that's really not very much material. And we could probably do it without any fanfare at all. We have enough of everything in North America to take care of ourselves. What's happening here, though, is people are being told that you can't live without a cell phone, personal computer, television set, flat screen, all that. For that, we need these critical materials in large quantities. And that is what we no longer control. We don't control our sources of them. That's the real problem. The real problem is political, not military, not existential. I am bored to death listening to being told that the U.S. military will collapse if it doesn't have enough rice wine or whatever is critical at the moment. Okay.
I mean, to be fair, without rice wine, it might collapse.
The point is that soldiers and sailors and airmen have been fighting without these critical materials for a long time. I've never seen a rifle that needs a rare earth permanent magnet or a pistol. I've certainly never seen a knife that needed anything but high quality steel. As far as add to that a stick and a stone, and you've got the weapons of the modern soldier, and or the Roman soldier or the Egyptian soldier, ancient Egyptian. So I'm not convinced that this emphasis on the existential crisis is correct, but we do not any longer supply ourselves securely with the materials we need for our lifestyle. That's the real problem.
No, that's a really good point. And as with everything, and as a couple of speakers had already mentioned, market dynamics drive a lot of this, including exactly what counts as critical. And there's no question about that. But and I assume Jeff will be joining us shortly. But even though he hasn't quite gotten here yet, I do want to sort of. Oh, is he here?
Yep.
Oh, I have too many people on my screen. I did not see that you snuck in. All right. In that case, before I go to the next thing, Jeff, you want to take a few minutes and introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly. So my name's Jeff Atkins. I've been involved in rare earth development since 2007. Been working really on the mine development phase. So started off with Lynas, going through Vital Metals, and now I consult to a number of rare earth miners and operators around the world. So my perspectives are, I guess, a little bit different from what Jack's is that I'm looking at it purely from a how do you get mines into operation? And like with Jack, I don't necessarily see it as I look at this also with a level of skepticism, in that I've looked at a number of projects and working on a number of projects where I can see that there is a pathway to production for these projects. They can make a profit in the current state. What they can't do is, and this is, I think, the biggest thing as well from a market-driven perspective, everybody seems to think that you need to be a multi-billion-dollar company, and that you have to be this massive operation as a multi-billion-dollar company. The fact of the matter is, rare earths in particular are very small operations. So if you take it with that lens and you're happy just producing a relatively small operation, you can get quite profitable. You can get into operation. It just means parking the ego at the door. And I think that's probably the biggest issue that we currently find at the moment.
So that actually is an excellent segue to the next question I wanted to ask. So I'll let it go to you first. And as we go across the other panelists, let it get a little more broad, but we'll definitely start with the mining side, because that's where all of this starts. And in the context of COP30 Brazil, the impact on climate and the environment, I think everybody kind of understands that historically mining is a pretty dirty process. It's not great for the surrounding environment in general. I know a lot of advances have been made in sort of the hygiene of mining in recent decades. You hear things about even more advances being made in China. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But from your perspective, thinking about bringing a mine online, how do you get something online in the modern first world where we may have more regulations and more concerns with, you know, the cleanliness of the mining operation?
Very, very simply, actually. I don't agree that the mining operation and mining is inherently dirty or toxic or anything like that. That is up to the choice of the operator.
Okay.
And what you see, it all comes down to who is the operator. If you choose to, you can operate in a very clean manner. And that is the way that 90% of operators today work. If you look at the mining industry, the majority of remediation technologies, a lot of environmental cleanup technologies, all of those sort of things have actually come out of the mining sector. So, I think it's a very dangerous word to state that you can't mine cleanly. The other thing which I will say is if you look at photos, the photos which get sent out about, rare earth mines in China, they're from the 80s. The operations there today are very different to what they were in the 80s as well. So there are a lot of controls in place. And the reality is that for a mining operation, you are in a local community for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So you have to understand that what you do today will impact generations in that local community. You cannot afford to go in there and not use industry best practice for environmental protection. And that is really the key to it. There are many ways that you can ensure that you have a clean operation. From a monitoring perspective, you track all of the groundwater. You track the air. You track everything. From an engineering perspective, you manage what you have in tailings facilities to make sure that they are robust. To me, it's a simple question of have a look at the people who you're dealing with. Like from an investor perspective or from a government perspective, look at who you're dealing with and look at their record because it's their choice. The other thing I'll say is that, the comments around we don't want to invest or we don't want to buy from projects in certain countries because they have lax environmental regulations. To me, that's an absolute load of rubbish. The reason being, once again, is that it's the company's choice in terms of how they operate. It doesn't matter what the regulations are. Every project I've been involved with, we've never set and said, what are the regulations? What's the minimum that we can do? That's not how you operate because regulations change. You have a responsibility to deal with the local community. So you always do the best that you possibly can.
Yeah, that's really an interesting take. A couple points in there. So one is the advances that have come out of the mining industry that now the rest of the world is using in terms of environmental cleanup and handling. I think people tend to underestimate where innovation originates. We see this like even the U.S. military and their helmet technology comes out of the NFL. Because the NFL player cares so much about their player safety, right? And it's not really surprising that an organization that's going to spend 20, 30, 50 years in a community is going to care about that community and invent the things they need to do to make those relationships work over time. And it's absolutely no surprise to me that the industry is ahead of regulation because my background's in tech. Regulation just can't keep up with the rate of industrial change. So that was awesome. Jack, let me throw it back to you. Maybe you could talk to that same point beyond the edges of mining as we move into extraction and processing. How should we think about the environmental impact of these industries?
what we have now is the Hollywood version, which is pervasive in our culture. Uh, I think the average person thinks of mining and refining as if it's Egyptian slaves on terraces with stone mallets chipping out bits of copper ore and then throwing them into a giant pot, giving off black clouds of poison. Okay. And what people forget is that it's really difficult to 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 seek employees by telling them, "Oh, you probably won't live out the week, but but the benefits for your widow and children are good." Okay, this country had the United States, Canada, this area. We have the safest, most modern mining and refining in the world. If you've ever actually been in a chemical processing plant, the very first concern is safety. And this has been the case. It wasn't always this way. A century ago, it wasn't quite as nice. But we've been through a time of let's say vast improvements in health and safety. And I admit, even our environmental laws have actually done good, because in order to meet them, you have to make things safer and cleaner. And I can't overemphasize that chemical engineering is not a death sentence. Working in an oil refinery is not a death sentence. You would think that from listening to the press or looking at the stupid films about all the explosions in oil fields. Okay, we are the best. But and what Jeff brought up reminds me of the fantasy of Chinese success, and I'll tell you what it is. The Chinese, for a long time, did not capitalize health and safety. So I would say, all right, let's say it costs $50 to produce a kilogram of neodymium in Mountain Pass, California, okay? And the Chinese are selling it for 25. So if we applied to them the same regulations we have about health and safety, theirs would be $100. Okay, but we don't do that. We say, oh my God, they're so much cheaper than we are. And another fantasy that the Chinese have low labor costs. Guess what? They're catching up very fast, and costs in China are not what they were 50 years ago. I agree with Jeff. Their mining and refining has really improved in health and safety, as have their costs. Today, China imports nearly half of the ores they process in their own country. Why is that? Because environmentally, they can't do the mining anymore in China. This particularly goes in heavy rare earths, for which they were literally raping the ground to produce dysprosium and terbium, and leaving behind destroyed agricultural land, polluted rivers. The Chinese banned all of this in 2014 and exported their agricultural rape to the nation of Myanmar, which now produces most of the heavy rare earths by the same processes that are banned in China. So everybody has to keep in mind that you can't keep doing things without regard to life, health, and safety for very long. That's in fact a measure of the spread of our civilization as this stops. It's happening in Africa right now. It's stopping. And so we in America can be competitive right now with anybody, providing we all play by the same rules. That's the issue.
Well, all playing by the same rules is a whole different panel or two, and definitely something that doesn't happen today. But okay, let's take that same question and go. Tracy, do you want to chime in anything extra beyond what these gentlemen added?
No, I'm enjoying listening, Chris.
Okay, what about you, Adam?
No, I think they're making great points, and I agree that any mine that I've been to, any industrial facility that I've been at, it's safety first. It's, sort of these are the environmental approaches, strategies, how we handle wastewater treatments, all this kind of stuff. Like these are priorities everywhere you go. I think that, Jack is onto a great point. The China got ahead because they did do things like in situ leaching, just pouring chemicals on the ground and letting the minerals flow down the hill and capturing them and doing all this stuff. And there's a value to that from a economic standpoint. When you aren't going to, when it would have cost to use Jack's numbers 100 and it only costs them 25, that is what allows them to get ahead. But that money that they made by, sort of avoiding all of the environmental regulations, all of the labor rights, devaluing currency, all these things that they did and they put on their populace got them ahead. And what's important about getting ahead from an industrial standpoint is your capex is old and sort of your efficiencies are good and you're qualified in and you've got all of the systems working. When you're dealing with chemical processes or mining processes, optimizing yields and optimizing performance requires you to run over a period of time. You have to continuously do that. And unless you can continuously do that, you can't optimize. And they've been optimizing for decades. They've been doing that and they've had the advantage of that. There's a benefit also to being the second mover, right? You can actually come in and use innovation in a different way. You don't have to rely on all of that. You can actually think, a little bit more creatively. You can actually step in and sort of have advantages. Think of like your internet speed. The US sort of laid a bunch of broadband, and then all of a sudden South Korea goes and lays broadband that's 10 times faster because they use the technology of the current day instead of the technology of the old day. So we have to be smart, right? And that's where it goes back to, the intelligence of it, the data, the knowledge. I think continuing to build that. One thing that's been really powerful in the last year, and then I think 5 years too, but like is the awareness of this issue. I haven't been in the industry as long as Jack or Jeff. When I first got into the industry, it was 2019, and nobody knew that a rare earth magnet went in a motor. Like they were like, does this go into a battery or what? And no one knew where their supply chain was coming from. So like, we've grown really, really rapidly, and we are, in these last 5 years. And we have to keep it up. I think there has to be a sustained push because in the end, we have seen these cycles before. The MP facility got built up in 2011 because prices went up, and then they crashed and the whole business went under, and that's how MP became MP, right? Because they bought it when it was in bankruptcy. And you have to realize that these cycles are going to happen and build resiliency around these supply chains. I think that's really going to be the question is, now once we're out of this hype cycle of this year, what happens next? Like, where do we go from here and how do we really dig in and build this? And that's where I think the real challenge is going to come. My biggest fear when I see some of this stuff is, the behavior of like, oh, we had a good conversation in China, the problem's solved. Oh, we did this investment in this one company, the problem's solved. Like it's really just, and that's where the political aspects of it, really become problematic because, on one hand, again, to Jack's point, you have this frenetic sort of almost hyper issue of like, everything is the most critical thing of all time, which is some level what you need in politics, right? Like, no one parties don't align unless there's, an external enemy type of thing. So you need that a little bit, but you have either that freneticism or you have like glad handing of like, oh, we just solved it, we're good, let's go move on to something else and forget that you exist. And that's
and I think that's actually we see this in every industry to greater or lesser extent. You get the boom and bust cycles as new things happen. But I do think over the last 3 or 4 years, the Western world, has really woken up to kind of what we let happen. Because to Jack's point, right, with this 50 years ago, we were the leader in all of these things, and we kind of let this happen to ourselves. We sat back and ate the popcorn. Okay, great. We watched the movie. Now we're unhappy with where we got. and I don't remember who it was, if it was you or Jack or Jeff, somebody was making the point. We have the opportunity, I think it was you, to do the same thing that like Southeast Asia did with mobile technology, right? They didn't have to go from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G. They went from nothing to 5G. And, North America and Europe are now in that position where we're like, okay, so we were the leaders 50, 60, 70 years ago. Then we let it go away for a while. Does that mean we can now take those learnings and leapfrog? And I don't even know if we want to be in a leadership position, but at least be in a competitive enough leadership position, because I do think there's value in global trade, right? It's not, you don't want to manufacture everything in your own backyard necessarily, but you want to be able to, and you want to be able to do it with some things. Are we
Chris,
now, Canada, US, Europe, in a position to do that?
I can add to the conversation here. I mean, we're looking at China China has been through the gauntlet, so to speak. I mean, they've expedited the process on all of these materials. By 2046, these guys are going to be recycling all of their commodities. So like, yeah, they've been big miners. They've gone through all sorts of cycles. I mean, that's a big statement. How true is that? I don't know. But the fact that they're initiating recycling and all of their materials, ultimately taking all of those critical materials and putting back into, whether it be solar panels to whatever other products. I mean, that's something to really take into account. I mean, ultimately, we need more. That's the big takeaway. We need more commodities and we need more investment in these mines. And if these mines aren't coming online as quick as we want them to, how do we kind of expedite the process? So, you look at, we were representing various types of lithium companies back in 2011 and educating our investors on the fact that lithium isn't just for medical applications and medicine, but for the future of batteries and, obviously what we're experiencing today. And, you saw that pump up in that cycle, a bit of a pullback. And now we're seeing, hard rock obviously has taken off because it's understood from the mining sector. But then there's also DLE, direct lithium extraction technology on the brines, which could change the economics and could expedite the process on the US and other countries obtaining, Argentina is obviously, very robust in that commodity and that type of lithium. That could change the economics and expedite the process on us obtaining the lithium that we need. Standard Lithium has been doing a good job there. Robert Mintak going back in the day with him, even the Pure Energy days in Albemarle. But, so you think of these technologies and innovation changing the landscape to, obtain these commodities. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is, identifying these recycling technologies to take, what's being put into landfills and, putting them through these technologies ultimately to recover what we need, that urban mining. And I think there's a place for both the traditional mining sense. I think that a lot of us have seen the royalty funds emerge more and more. So getting involved at an early stage, and that provides a little bit of a testament to, the DD that these fund managers are going through with those applications. And think of a royalty fund model. I mean, there's no CapEx, no OpEx for these groups. So that, from an investor's perspective, is appealing to me. And then you have these, emerging royalty and streaming companies that are putting money into and even VCs that are putting money into these modular systems that are processing these end-of-life valuable e-waste type of applications, ultimately, again, to produce these commodities that we need. So again, there's a space for these urban mining technologies and the space for investment into traditional mining.
Yeah, Trevor, that's a great point, that there is definitely innovation in this entire space, including on the recycling side, and a number of technologies are continually being advanced. So we are up against the clock here a little bit, but Jack, let me come back to you. Given, not worried about the specifics of what technologies are on the horizon, but back to that question of, are we in a position to leapfrog or at least jump far enough up to make the world competitive again? So it's not a one-player game. It's not monopolistic. Are we there? Are we not there? Do we have hard work to do?
Well,
what's your view?
Talking economically, that's a problem. Okay. If everything has to be profitable, that's the issue is simple. It's, can you be profitable? Okay. And in my opinion, the answer is no. Okay. The Chinese are concerned with capacity. They're concerned with their national security. And the last thing they're concerned about is profitability. However, we do know that they will run out of money sooner or later because they do not seem to care about, their focus is not on profitability. Their focus is on production, which is the history of Soviet and Chinese socialist systems. Production is the king, not profitability, obviously. Okay. So what we can be secure and independent, for example, in the United States and North America in general. And I think we can do that in a capitalist way by having profitable companies. I'll tell you what the problem is. Some of our companies are too big to succeed, just what the previous speakers have said. There's no point to a giant rare earth company because the market is not giant, okay? There's no point to a giant lithium company in the United States. We just don't need that much of it. Now, if you're going to export it, you're right up against the same old problem. The other guy has got 25 years experience on you. And I'm not a big believer in economy of scale, but I'll tell you what, those who have economy of scale have gone through all the low cost options. You can't easily compete with them because they've done everything. They've tried everything. Okay. And my opinion, I know I'm a one-off guy here. I don't think the United States is going to be independent of the world in critical materials. I just don't. Okay. Yeah, but we can be secure in the necessary things the things we need. For example, we now produce in America 70 million tons of steel a year. China produces 1.1 billion tons. Are we really going to catch up with them? And yet, this is the steel age. It's not the age of critical mineral. It's not the age of Taylor Swift. This is the steel age. It succeeded the Iron Age in 1867 when Bessemer's converter worked. Okay? And that is the most important material in our culture, steel. Okay? And the United States said, well, what difference does it make? You know, we can always get it from the other guy. Well, can we? I don't think so.
Yeah.
And by the way, one last thing I
point.
want to say. Historians, not me, have said this. No nation ever won a war if it produced less steel than its opponent. Think about it.
I will, in fact, think about that. All right, let's do a quick roundtable. I don't know if they're going to kick us out or shut us down or whatever, but just a couple closing comments from everybody. Jeff, let's go over to you.
Yeah, look, I think I have a slightly different opinion to Jack on this one, on the idea of profitability, in that I see no reason why companies in the West, in the US, can't be profitable. Yeah, with current technologies, we have a huge opportunity where the fact of the matter is China's technology is 50, 60 years old. There is an opportunity there for improvement. What it takes is for executives to actually focus on how to make their projects profitable, not just look at how they can promote them to the biggest possible extent to try to increase their share prices, because that is not sustainable. And that's actually the biggest problem with the industry today, is you've got executives who are more focused on promoting the stock than actually trying to work out how to bring their projects into operation. If they put the focus into that, parked the ego at the door and said, okay, actually, to get our project into operation, we're better being a smaller operation where we can have a good IRR, you'd see a lot more operations on projects in operation today.
I definitely think if more execs talked about IRR, that would make the investors quite a bit happier. Adam, quick closing comment?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this has been super valuable. Jeff makes a great point. I think that we need a lot more seriousness. There's a lot of promoter behavior out there. And I think Jack makes a great point also about sort of the hurdle of what we have to deal with, right? I think one thing that I always think that helps is sort of like a North Star. I think we're always focusing to, I think Jack talked about this earlier, the demand for like the most critical stuff it's kind of small, actually.
Hmm.
And so you have this thing where it's like, how do you solve this big problem while solving it, pushing it into a small hole? It's like a big square and a small round hole. And it's like, I think one of the things that I always think about is what happens to our innovation ecosystem, like 20 years from now, 30 years from now, like whatever it is, like, the technology that we can't contemplate on this call, right? The next version of satellites and drones and telecommunications and iPhones and whatever else that like we want to invent that some kid who's not born yet wants to make and wants to go to a VC and say, hey, can I make this? I want to go get this funded and build it. And they say, we don't have any minerals for that. Where are you going to get and that 18-year-old or 24-year-old, whatever, says, it all comes from China. The VC is going to say, good luck, kid, get out of here. And
Well,
if you
I
do that
certainly
a
hope the
thousand
kid says it all
times,
comes from Mars on that timeline, but
if
that's a different
you do
story.
that a thousand times every year for a decade or two, think about how far we are behind on innovation. And I think that's where criticality comes to me in some of this stuff.
All right, everybody. Tracy and Trevor, I apologize for not giving you final closing comments, but I've been given the hook. So with that, I think we're going to hand this off. Thank you all for joining us. I know the time was a little tight and we certainly didn't get to cover everything, but hopefully it gave our audience a little insight into this incredibly complicated, interesting, and potentially very profitable and not bad for the environment industry. Thanks all.